webinar. So as Liz mentioned earlier, we did this as a face-to-face version last week and had a really good debate about what's most effective, coaching or telling. So hopefully we'll have the same today. So for those of you who don't know Head, Heart and Brain, we are a leadership development company. Our name describes what we do. So we work with the head, which is the rational content. We work with the heart, which is the engagement and buy-in of people, and we work with the brain. So that's in the main, taking the findings of neuroscience and applying those to our leadership and capability development. We have also, in the last year to 18 months, done a lot of work with organisations who are interested in understanding what's neuroscience saying about the way they design their HR policy and process. So things like their learning strategy and performance management. We've done work with organisations in those areas. So that's enough about us. You can see more if you're interested. Give me a call or have a look at our website. So, coaching versus telling. What we like to do with this is some polls, so you get a chance to actually have your say. And Liz, have we got this one up? Yeah. So let's just think about what some of the underlying assumptions are about coaching versus telling. Primarily, coaching holds the view that the employee understands their job and with some help can work out how to deal with issues and problems that arise in that job, and also how to perform to their maximum capacity with some coaching from their boss. A telling culture assumes that the boss knows the answer to any issues that might come up and understands the job in a way better than the employee in the job. And I guess, you know, one of the things we have to ask ourselves at this time is, can that be true given the complexity of the jobs most people are doing these days? So this little poll is just really a way of you giving some feedback about how much do employees in your organisation need help to change, and roughly what percentage of employees have at least one career limiting work issue. And we'll share some data at the end of this about a poll that was done, not by us, but by some other people asking some similar questions. Okay, so it looks like most employees have between 10 and 50% of employees have at least one career limiting issue. And we've got 35% with 50 to 70%, goodness me. So we need to give those guys some help. Can I remove that poll now, Liz?
Yep. Okay, there's another one.
So before, yeah, we'll come to the next one in a minute. Before we start talking about coaching versus telling, one of the things I wanted us just to kind of bring to mind is I've put a number of questions in on each of these slides, and I think if you think about those questions as we talk about what's in the content here, it will make some of what we're saying more relevant to you. So we've talked about Carol Dweck's work on mindset before, but for those of you who haven't heard about this, Carol Dweck is a professor at Stanford, and she's been studying for many years the beliefs and mindset of people who are most successful. And what she's found is there are basically two mindsets when you're thinking about success and thinking about the way people are managed. One is a fixed mindset that assumes people are born with the talent and intellect and capability, and there's not really that much you can do about it. And managers who hold that mindset are very unlikely to want to coach. They're more likely to believe they know what the answer is and they can tell the employee the right way of solving a problem and the right way of doing their job. Carol Dweck's other finding is that there are people who hold what she calls a growth mindset, and people with a growth mindset believe that no matter how smart people happen to be, they can always get better. So that they can learn from coaching, they can learn from role models, they can learn from taking risks, um, doing stretching jobs, those types of things. And people with this mindset, what Dweck's work has found, are much more likely to give performance feedback, they're more likely to coach, and they're more likely to look for uh, opportunities for people to stretch and grow their skills. And I guess the point about this is if you think about what's the prevailing mindset in your organization, because if it's a fixed mindset, no matter how much you encourage your managers to coach, they're unlikely to be very enthusiastic about it because, in effect, their beliefs are what's the point? People can't change that much anyway. So, worth thinking about that, and whether that's on an individual level or across your whole culture. And there's more about that on our website if you want to understand a bit more about Carol Dweck's work. So think about yourself. How do you tend to react when someone tells you to change? So we have another little poll here, Liz. So thinking about employees' career limiting issues. So the question we asked at the beginning, where we had something like 80% of them with career limiting issues. What are those career limiting issues actually about? Are they about their personal style, the way they manage people, or about their technical competence? Interesting. Seems most of this is about their personal style. Oh, no, people stuff is coming up fast. So interesting, very little is about technical competence. And I think that's doubly interesting because what the science seems to be telling us is that telling someone how to do a task better can work, particularly if you're telling them about, the process or procedure, and you're telling them before they've really embedded that task as something they believe they're good at. And yet that tends to be the area that few people need help on, according to this poll. So thank you very much for that. Very interesting. Liz, can we clear that? So let's think about how our brain responds to getting new information or being asked to adopt a new skill. And basically, what the brain is doing is creating a mental map. So this is a metaphor, of course, but our brain is actually links new information to old information. It likes to be able to simplify things, categorize them, and to make sense of them. And whilst that sounds very simple, it's actually very complex. To give you a sense of that, the brain's making something like 1 million new connections every second. So every time you hear my voice and you take that information in, it's linking that new information to information you already have, to beliefs and values and experience that you have, memories that you have in the past. The brain also likes order, so it likes to be able to predict what's coming. And one of the issues of when we're telling people is that that prediction may be out of sync with what the employee was expecting to hear. So the more we embed that information, the more energy efficient it is for our brain to deal with it. So when we first hear something new, it can be take quite a lot of brain energy to process that information. That's why we often find ourselves really consolidating that information and beginning to really understand it when our brain's in not dealing with lots of additional stuff. So, when you're going for a walk or at the gym or stirring the soup or when you're doing something kind of slightly mindless, that's when those connections often link up and we get that sort of sense of, oh, yes, now I understand what this was all about. So those mental maps are important, and the operating system of the brain is to push as much information as it can into the habit system, where it can be dealt with in a much more energy efficient way. Liz, we've got another poll here. Lindsay's also posted here for you the stuff on growth mindset and organizational performance off of our website, which is an article that I did after a talk that Carol Dweck did on her latest research. So here we're asking, what's the percentage of people that make lasting change against those issues that they have, those work issues? And what we're seeing here is between 10 to 50% tend to make lasting change, which actually is quite not bad, quite good, and certainly higher than some other research we've seen. Okay, I think we've got the votes in there. So in order to help people make that lasting change, what works best? Well, one of the issues with telling people to do something is you can create a threat response in the brain. We quite frequently talk about threat. And the reason this happens is that thing about us liking to be able to predict what's going to happen. So when someone tells you something to follow a new procedure or to do work in a different way, that can often be a shock for us, and that sets up a threat response, which in turn sets up a wish to move away from that information, to close off and not have to consider it. So if you think about those times when you're kind of slightly irritated by someone telling you to do something different, or you ignore someone's advice, that's a mild threat response happening in your brain. And some interesting research that's been done where they put people in a scanner and actually looked at what when they told them the way to be successful versus coached them. And what they found was when they told people how to be more effective in their job, people actually, the areas of the brain associated with the threat response actually activated. So some real sort of physical evidence that that's what's happening when you tell people what to do. The other issue with the threat response is if it's very strong, it begins to impact our cognitive functioning. So our rational, logical prefrontal cortex closes down or stops functioning so well, while our emotional brain because our emotional brain takes all the energy away. So that's one reason I think why managers get so frustrated, that they feel like they've told people more than once what to do. And it's often the reason that they feel that is because the person wasn't able to take in the information that they were hearing. So even if you are going to tell people, you need to give them some time to really process that information and create that mental map for themselves. So the other thing this research found was when they scanned people's brains, when they asked them questions about their purpose and what was in it for them to change, they found that actually the reward response in the brain was actually activated. So what this is telling us is helping people to understand, why do I want to change? What do I want to do differently? And how will that be a benefit for me? How will it link with what my job means to me and what it's all about? Is actually creating a reward response. So another reason for really coaching people rather than telling them. And as we know, when you have a reward response, you move towards that new information, you engage with it, and you're much more likely to feel motivated to actually continue to do something different. So we've talked about mental maps, but there's another way in which we use information, and that's through achieving insight. And I think one of the premises of coaching, as we talked about right at the beginning, is that people can work things out for themselves. And often the way they work things out for themselves is because they are encouraged to think about something in a different way. So insight is that kind of aha moment that you get when two pieces of information connect up in a way you haven't thought about them before. Or if you're stuck on something, you suddenly see a different perspective and are able to think about it in a different way. Insight tends to be created when people are asked what's called powerful questions. So when they're asked questions that help them to look at information or think about information anew. And what's actually happening there is new neural networks are connecting up. So people are extending that map, if you like, that we talked about earlier. So I wonder what people's kind of sense is of when they have those aha moments. What are the times when that happens for you guys? You can type this into the box. And while you're doing that, I just want to say hello to some of our clients from Australia who are on the line. Really great to see you, Emily and Scylla. Fantastic to have you on the line from there. So we're saying here that people get a combination of powerful questions and deep listening and genuine empathy. Yeah, empathy is really important here. So not least because what it's doing is making sure there is no sense of threat, and that you're also much more open. The science on insight tells us that people have those insights when they're feeling comfortable and relaxed, when they're in a good mood, basically, when there is no sense of threat, and when their brain is relatively quiet. So when they're not processing lots of information at once, they're able just to focus on the one issue. So Jason is saying here, when there's a mutual understanding, yep, that's part of that openness and connection with the other person. So insight can be a very powerful way of helping people to think differently about their issues. And the other thing about insight is it permanently changes the brain, because once you've had that insight, that neural network is going to be different forevermore. But if you think about those insights you seem to have had yourselves, and we've all had them from time to time, they also come with a burst of energy. So they come with the motivation to do something different. But one of the issues is that energy tends to dissipate very quickly as we get busy with the normal things that we do. So part of what can be really powerful is coaching people not just to have the insight, but to stay on track with applying that insight and really thinking through what do I need to do to actually start to work differently now that I have had the insight. And that's really around creating new goals and linking that to people's sense of purpose in their job. So managers who focus on helping people transfer skills take coaching a step further and actually help people to not just understand what they should do differently, but how they can do something differently and how they can maintain the insight that they've had. Yeah, so Martin here is saying that this maintaining bit is really important because so many of our insights get lost during the day. One of the, just a little tip or trick for that is to carry a small notebook with you and actually jot those insights down before they have a chance to disappear, and then just review them at the end of the day. So we've got Jean also saying here that they've got a new director who's been amazing in shifting the culture by adopting more of this type of helping people create insight. That's really interesting, Jean. And another comment here is that people get insights when they leave an issue to sort of on the back burner, so to speak. And that's also part of what the neuroscience is showing. That's when our brain is quiet. So if you're stuck with something, or one of your employees is stuck with something, often asking them to just reflect on it on the back burner, i.e. not actively, or to think about it overnight, can be a good way of those insight moments being created. And Emily's saying she gets aha moments when she's reflected on her own learning. Yeah, another really good tip there. There's some very interesting research that came out the middle of last year that said employees that spend 15 minutes reflecting on their learning during the day and just jotting down those reflections are 23% more productive and apply much more of the learning that they've had. So the point here is coaching's much more likely to generate those insights than telling someone what to do. And it also gives you the opportunity of helping people to take that insight and do something with it. So we're seeing here that people are beginning to adopt this as part of their strategy. So once people have had the insight and decided it is something they want to do something with, the next thing is how do you permanently help people to make those changes? So we're back here to talking about habit. So for those of you who haven't heard about habit before, and again, there's stuff on our website about this. If you want to read a bit more about it. The neuroscientists, particularly a guy called Kevin Oshner, estimate that only about 30% of what we do is directly under our control, so under the control of our prefrontal cortex. And that's intentional behavior, and that's usually new behavior. The rest of what we do is automatic or semi-automatic. So we do it out of the basal ganglia, which is our habit system. And as we've mentioned before, there's a good reason for this, in that it allows us to use a part of the brain that's much more energy efficient. And we don't have to think of something new every time we come to do it. So we know how to open the door. We don't have to consciously think about that. We probably also know how to get to work, get up in the morning, have a shower, clean our teeth. All of those sorts of things are done out of our habit system. But when we want to change, we have to combine both that habit system and our prefrontal cortex, because our new goals are formed in our prefrontal cortex and our habits are in our limbic system in the basal ganglia. So we need to bring those two together, and in order to do that, typically people need support. And what the research on goals is showing us is they need to be able to have a cue, so something that tells them to have to act in a new way. So, for example, if your cue in the morning is to come in and take your coat off and sit down at your computer, the cue is probably I take my coat off, I immediately go to my computer, I start doing my emails, and that gives me, so the routine is your emails, and that gives me a reward of a sense of control. I know what's going on, I know what the team are up to. For a manager or an individual who wants to be more connected with their team, they can adopt that same cue. So they can come in, take their coat off, but instead of sitting down at their computer, they walk out of their office and actually start walking around and talking to members of the team. So their new routine is to walk around and talk to people. The reward they get is the same because they learn what people are doing and they get that sense of control, but in a very different way, with knock-on positive impacts for the team in that they get that connection with their boss. And Lindsay said we've got a short video on this. Sorry, we've got a short video on insight moments on our website. It's called A Moment of Insight, if people are interested in learning a little bit more about that. So again, if you tell someone what to do, they won't have embedded that cue, routine, and reward. And that's why often, again, managers get very frustrated when they feel that there's a logical reason why someone should do something, but they appear to persist in not doing it. And that's because the old behavior is taking over, particularly when people are very busy, very tired, or feeling stressed. So in terms of the coaching that goes on in your organization, how much coaching goes on to support people to create new habits as opposed to just having the insight of what they should do differently? Let's have a little look at what people say in the chat box here. So we've got people here talking about how they kind of almost coach themselves to change their own style. So one thing is having the insight that you need to do your job differently. The other is setting up your own cue, routine, and reward. And one way of doing that is some work by a guy called B.J. Fogg at Stanford, who has adopted an approach which he calls tiny habits, and that's to make one tiny little change, almost the smallest change that you can make, and make that one change first. So Your new routine might be you'll walk out of your office and talk to your team for 2 minutes. And gradually, what you do is extend that routine as you begin to reap the benefits of the new habit. So, Guy's here recommending a book called Making and Breaking Habits by Jeremy Dean. Yep, I've read his. The other book that's really fantastic is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And Rachel saying, really nice to see you on the line, Rachel. Hi, haven't spoken for years. I think people fall back into task mode and become very inflexible if they don't take time to think and socialize. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. And one of the things that can be really helpful in coaching people to make new habits is to use social support and social pressure. So to help people share what they want to do differently sets up that kind of sense of obligation to do the new routine and to make a bit more effort to do that. So Louise is saying something very similar to that they have weekly one-to-ones which incorporate things that they can do differently as we learn to coach each other. Really good technique there. Yeah, and Louise making the observation that there's a real focus on this when you've got new teams forming. So that's part of the social pressure. You want to be part of that new team. That new team is valuable to you. It gives you a sense of connection to be with those people. And so again, that helps you to overcome the old behavior and adopt the new behavior. So let's talk a little bit about, we saw what your polls came out with. So some research here I found about those work habits. So what this research that was done by a group called Vital Smarts is that something like 97% of employees tend to have at least one career limiting issue. And this research talked to about 2,000 managers about their employees. So I think that's higher than we were seeing on our polls, but nonetheless, we were up in the 70s, I think. What these managers said is only 10 to 20% of people were able to make lasting change. Now, maybe that was because they were telling them rather than coaching. And so people didn't have that support to make the change and quickly went back to their old behavior. And then addressing these issues was 3 times more important than addressing technical skills. So I think that's very similar to the sort of data that we found, that actually the issues that really impact people's jobs is much more about their own personal style and their own dealings with people. And those are exactly the things that don't really work very well to be told, because we set up that threat response, people move away from the advice, they feel resentful about it. They possibly don't have the time to see what's in it for them, and it doesn't fit with their kind of map of the world. So let's look at some questions that you may want to use if you're trying to persuade people in your organization why coaching rather than telling might be helpful. So some questions here to reflect on, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on the chat line. Well, and Guy said the paradox would be that you can't tell people they should be coaching. They need to experience it. I completely agree, Guy, and that's the beginning of, I've written an article on this, which is on the website, and that is my opening statement. So I think these are some questions that might be helpful if you want to persuade a manager that taking more of a coaching approach might be helpful to them with their team. So asking them, how did someone react when you told them to change? And I don't know what people think there, but well, you can tell us what people think. So what reaction do you get when you tell people to change? And when has telling someone to do something differently actually worked? And I think there are a few instances where that can work. So people are answering that first question. So what's their reaction? So resistance, people get defensive, people resist it. Get interesting point from Barbara here saying telling only gets a short-term result. Yeah, when I used to work in corporate life, I often found that people would do what you asked, what you told them to do whilst you were in the room, and then reverted back to their old way of working as soon as you left. And Emily here saying, if I'm told to do something, I always ask the question why. Yeah. So it can set up quite a kind of tense situation between the manager and the employee. And Jason makes the interesting point linking back to fixed mindset, that with a fixed mindset, people don't want to change. And that's absolutely right, Jason. It's actually quite threatening for them because it tends to have the underlying implication that what they're doing isn't right. And if you believe you can't change very much, then that's going to be quite scary. So one of the things we've done with organizations who've got a fixed mindset culture is really work with their managers to understand when have they actually changed and when have they learned to do something different and been successful. And that tends to shift the mindset, tends to shift the belief system. So Scylla's saying here, telling might work on a process, procedural change, but never on a behavioral change. Yeah, that's the point, that often on a task, particularly before people have kind of embedded it as part of what they do, that can be quite helpful. Interesting comment from Martin saying that it depends on the stage of people's careers. When they need directing, as they become more experienced, coaching approach would work. Yeah, there's some quite interesting conflicting feedback, I think, about the new generations coming into work who seem to want quite a lot of feedback, but they at the same time believe that life has changed so much that often senior people, people who are more mature, shall we say, in their working careers, don't actually understand how to do a job these days, particularly where they're high on technology. So you have to watch some of that. So quite a few people mentioning this thing about telling can be useful when it's process orientated. And Louise making the interesting point about leading by example. If you're being asked to change something, the manager should show that they have changed as well. Really great point there, Louise. And then Emily talking about a book called Time to Think by Nancy Klein. Yeah, Nancy Klein's a very famous lady for pointing out that if you give people time to contribute and think, they get much more insight and aha moments. And actually, I know Nancy, and one of the things she did with a neuroscientist is look at why that works. And it's because it sets up that reward process in the brain rather than a threat process in the brain. So Jasper here making a really interesting point of telling has blame attached to it. Yeah, so it's basically saying you didn't know what you should be doing in the first place. and it also allows people to kind of disassociate themselves from it. They told me to do it, and takes away people's accountability. A really great point there, Jasper. And Barbara saying telling is like selling, but does not always get people's buy-in. Paul Brown, you're absolutely right, Guy. He is the person who worked with Nancy Klein. So our last couple of questions here in our last minute. So the other questions you might want to use is what have been the benefits for you of encouraging insights in others? And often also asking people what are the benefits for you when you've had insights yourself? And then what good surprises have you got when asking questions rather than telling people? So some questions there that might be helpful to you, both for yourself and for your managers. So interesting comment here from Jackie saying it can be interesting when someone resists a coaching approach and can drive the manager towards telling. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I guess that might be the time when the manager gets to practice even more insightful questions if they can. I think the bottom line for me here is, can we really expect managers to understand how to do everybody else's job as well as their own? And particularly how to solve problems in those jobs. They're just not close enough to them these days. So being able to ask insightful questions becomes even more important. So as I said, there's an article on the website that summarizes this talk if you want to download that. There will also be this webinar up on the website early tomorrow or even later today, and Liz will send you out a note about that. And as most of you know, we have two books. One's Brain Savvy HR, which really looks at what's HR saying about, what's neuroscience saying about HR policy and process. And the other book is called Brain Savvy Leading, which is really tips and hints. So it's got on one side of the page something briefly about neuroscience, and on the other side it's got a tip or a hint. And Emily here just lastly saying, I think there's also motivational coaching to do here if people resist. Yeah, and that's really going back to that point about linking to people's purpose and what's in it for them. And then finally, a big thank you to Liz for hosting this webinar. She's told you a little bit about what she does. And look forward to seeing you next time. So our next webinar is on interviewing and neuroscience. And we'll be drawing from an article that Lindsay wrote, which was one of the top 10 most read articles on HR Zone in 2014. So some interesting stuff there. And then the one after that, which is in May, is on neuroscience motivation and reward policies. So might be interesting for some of your people. And that might be something you want to pass on to your reward people as well if they are not part of this club. So thank you very much. Some really interesting comments and questions here. And I will pull those polls together and also pull together some of the suggestions that you guys have made so that can be shared as well across the group. Many thanks, people, for your interest, and we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jam. Thank you, everybody. Brilliant. Thank you. Let's let everybody just